In the middle of a blizzard, an old farmer stumbled across a frozen lump in the snow, a bobcat kitten barely clinging to life. Everyone said he was crazy to try saving it. Everyone said it was already too late. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the hiss of the wood stove and the wet, ragged sound of shallow breaths. Thomas set the bundled kitten down on an old flannel shirt spread near the fire, his thick fingers moving with surprising care. The heat from the stove quickly melted the clumps of snow clinging to the kitten's fur, revealing patches of frostbite along the tiny paws and the tips of the ears. Thomas frowned. He knew enough about the wild to recognize the odds. This little one was more ghost than animal now. Still, he moved with quiet urgency. He filled a chipped enamel mug with warm goat's milk, then rooted through Marie's cabinet until he found an old medicine dropper. Crouching beside the fire, he gently pried the kitten's mouth open and squeezed a single drop onto its tongue. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch of the tongue. Thomas leaned back on his heels, heart hammering in his chest. "That's it, kid," he muttered under his breath. "You fight." For hours he rotated the kitten between the warm flannel and the cradle of his rough palms, offering drop after drop of milk. His knees ached from kneeling. His back protested from hunching. He ignored it all. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the windows, rattling the old cabin like a living thing. But inside, there was only the stubborn warmth of one man's refusal to let another life slip away. By the time the storm began to die down, the kitten's breathing had steadied slightly. Its tiny body, no longer rigid with cold, curled instinctively into the crook of Thomas's palm. In the pale morning light filtering through the frost-glazed windows, Thomas studied the kitten properly for the first time. Delicate black spots against pale gold fur, a faint ruff forming along its jawline. Even in its battered state, it was beautiful. A wave of emotion rose in Thomas's throat. Grief for Marie, pride in this little scrap of defiance, a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its strength. He pulled the blanket tighter around them both and closed his eyes for a moment, exhausted but oddly at peace. Outside, the first rays of sun clawed their way over the white fields, glinting on every frozen branch and fence post. Inside, by the dying fire, something even rarer was taking shape. Not just survival, but something closer to hope. And it all started with a choice Thomas hadn't expected to make and a kitten that refused to give up. The days blurred together, a soft rhythm of survival punctuated by the slow, stubborn will of a creature too small to understand the odds stacked against it. Snow drifted against the cabin windows like powdered ghosts, muffling the world outside into a heavy silence. Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped the kitchen in a cocoon, flickering light dancing across Chance's makeshift cradle and the deep lines worn into Thomas's weathered face. Chance grew in fits and starts, every tiny victory hard-earned and celebrated in the quiet language of glances and touches. When the kitten first managed to lift his head and croak out a pitiful squeak, Thomas barked a short laugh, the sound catching roughly in his throat. When Chance batted weakly at the frayed tassel of Marie's old quilt, Thomas sat down heavily in the nearest chair, feeling a pride so fierce it scared him. He tried not to get ahead of himself. Wild animals belonged in the wild. He told himself this every morning as he measured out droplets of milk, cleaned Chance's bedding, and gently stretched the kitten's spindly limbs to coax movement back into the frost-stiffened muscles. But each night, when the wind howled around the eaves and Chance curled against his chest like a heartbeat, he thought he'd lost long ago. Thomas whispered promises he couldn't take back. "You're safe now," he would murmur into the dark. "You're not going anywhere." Outside the cabin, the world remained unchanged and unforgiving. Word spread through the small farming town faster than fire on dry brush. Folks who hadn't spoken to Thomas in years found reasons to drive past his property, their trucks idling just long enough for a hard stare. At the feed store, muttered warnings and skeptical looks followed him like a bad smell. "Should have left nature to herself," old Pete Granger grumbled once, not even pretending to whisper. "You don't make pets out of killers." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't have the energy for it. Let them talk, he thought grimly, hauling another armful of firewood into the cabin. Let them say what they would. They hadn't seen the way Chance struggled to stand, back legs trembling but refusing to give out. They hadn't seen the stubborn little flick of a tail when Chance finally managed 3 staggering steps across the rug before collapsing, panting but triumphant. They hadn't seen hope. In the end, Thomas figured, it wasn't about taming wild things. It was about meeting them where they were, broken, stubborn, half-ruined, and choosing to stand with them anyway. And he would keep standing, for as long as Chance needed him. The first truckloads of timber arrived in the pre-dawn hush, headlights slicing through the mist that clung low to the fields. Thomas stood in the cold mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, watching the workers unload the lumber that would become Chance's future. It wasn't grand, not by any stretch. Just a sturdy series of runs and a heated shelter tucked at the edge of the woods. But it was safe. It was freedom, bounded by trust rather than fear. Neighbors gathered at the fence line over the next few days, their faces lined with suspicion and curiosity. Some shook their heads and drove away. Others lingered longer, whispering under their breath. Thomas didn't bother explaining himself anymore. Those who needed to understand already did. Those who didn't never would. Chance watched everything from the porch, golden eyes alert and unblinking. His winter coat had thickened, a patchwork of tawny gold and dark rosettes, and the muscles under his young frame rippled with every stretch and lazy yawn. He was no longer the trembling scrap of fur Thomas had found buried in ice. He was a creature of raw, vivid life, untamed and unapologetic. Building the sanctuary was harder than Thomas expected. Every board nailed into place felt like a gamble against the future. Each dollar spent a question with no clear answer. Would Chance even stay? Would the town tolerate a wild sanctuary in their midst? Would it be enough? He wrestled with those questions late at night when the cabin was dark and quiet except for the low hum of the fire. Chance would pad over in those moments, settling his growing weight across Thomas's feet like a living stone, a silent reminder of the impossible hope they shared. Spring came early that year. By March, the enclosure was finished. A battered sign, hand-painted in Thomas's rough script, hung near the gate. For those who survive. Chance took to the new space immediately, exploring every corner, leaping effortlessly onto the thick branches Thomas had bolted into the frame. Watching him move, wild and unbroken, Thomas felt something inside him settle. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't even pride. It was a kind of reverence, born of struggle and choice. They hadn't beaten the world, but they had carved out a place in it, together. And when the first abandoned fawn arrived that spring, cradled in the arms of a rescue volunteer with tear-streaked cheeks, Thomas knew the sanctuary was never just about saving Chance. It was about saving himself, too. The sanctuary bustled with quiet life beneath the low, leaden sky. Snow dusted the fence rails and clung to the outlines of pine trees like powdered sugar, muffling the crunch of boots across the frozen ground. Children pressed mittened hands against the glass of the observation hut, pointing in awe as Chance slinked through the underbrush, his coat blending so perfectly into the winter palette, it was as if he were stitched from the land itself. Thomas lingered outside the main trail, apart from the crowds, his worn parka flapping in the sharp wind. He cradled the chipped coffee mug like a talisman, the heat biting into his weathered palms. Wrinkles carved deeper valleys into his face now, a roadmap of every hard year spent fighting for a life most others had written off. Chance had grown into his own legend. His muscles rippled with grace under the thick winter fur. His movements a dance between wariness and supreme confidence. He was no pet. He had never been a pet. He was freedom, captured in flesh and sinew, a creature who owed nothing to the world except the debt of his own survival. Thomas watched as Chance scaled a thick log in the enclosure, pausing at the top to survey his kingdom. For a moment, the young bobcat turned his head, fixing his gaze across the distance. Their eyes met, Thomas's deep brown and Chance's fierce gold, and for the span of a heartbeat, time forgot itself. A nod, a flick of a tail, and then Chance bounded down into the snowy grass, vanishing from sight, but not from memory. Thomas exhaled slowly, the mist of his breath mingling with the cold. He didn't need the crowds. He didn't need the quiet praise from the visiting conservationists or the newspaper article pinned proudly in the ranger station. He needed only this, the knowledge that when it had mattered most, he hadn't turned away. The sanctuary wasn't just a refuge for animals abandoned or broken by the world's indifference. It was a living story stitched together with every stubborn heartbeat, every choice to fight when giving up would have been easier. It was proof that hope didn't come easy, and it didn't come fast, but it could be built, nail by nail, act by act, into something real enough to weather any storm. In the distance, the laughter of children echoed across the field, bright and sharp against the gray sky. Thomas smiled into his coffee and let the warmth settle deep in his bones. He had kept his promise, and somewhere beyond the fence line, Chance thrived, wild, whole, and utterly free.